You may not know who these people are. Well, many of you may know who Alan Turing is because there was a movie that came out that got a lot of acclaim, The Imitation Game, about Alan Turing. And so Turing was one of the founders of modern computing technology and modern computer science. Voltaire, about as far away from computing as anybody in history could be, but Voltaire was a famous French essayist. What does he have to do with this? Well, Voltaire has a famous quote from one of his works about how we're living in the best of all possible worlds. We might not be living in the perfect world, but this is the best of all possible worlds. Okay? And so, what does that have to do with gerrymandering? Well, maps that you draw are made up of census tracts. That means, and all the districts have to have the same size, population-wise, roughly. That means there's a finite number of possible maps. Let's just draw all of them and see what the possibilities are. Now that number is enormous. Thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably millions, maybe even more zeros. I don't really know. So no human could do that. But what if we wrote an algorithm so a computer could do that? And a computer would generate all these maps and measure them, and then we could get a statistical distribution of what these maps look like. So right here, this is a histogram of a bunch of maps for Wisconsin. The horizontal axis here is how many seats are won on that map for the Republicans. Okay? And so 50 would be pretty even because the Wisconsin State Assembly has 99 seats. So 50 is even, 55 is a little higher, and remember we said that 60 was what actually happened. And so what you see here is that out of all of these randomly generated maps, most of them will give a slight majority to the Republicans. What they find when we investigate voting is that there's always a slight, it's hard to get perfect representation for some very interesting mathematical reasons. You expect a slight bonus to the overall winner. So this is the bonus, but you can see that the actual results in the real world were very unlikely. They were way over here on the tail of the probability distribution. And so what that tells us is that this was not, one thing it says is this was not just happenstance. The fact that the Wisconsin turnout was over here, it would be very unlikely to get that randomly, or if you were looking at other objective standards. It's much more likely that the people who drew the map were aiming for that result, because it's hard to get that result randomly. And so we can use data and computations to assess maps in this way. I think, personally, I find this a better way to go. Although you're getting into more statistics and math and algorithms, it makes it harder to make the court case. That's the nice thing about the efficiency gap. It's very easy to explain to 9 Supreme Court justices. This is a little harder to explain, but I think it has a little bit better standing. Well, look, we're just about perfectly on time, and here's the last slide. I don't expect you to memorize any of this. Maybe you'll see a few key words that you want to Google. This is just to throw up to show that there's all sorts of stuff you can read about this online. You can find news stories. You just put gerrymandering into any search engine or newspaper search engine. You can find stuff like that. This is the group who sponsored the conference that I went to. We have articles about all sorts of the Supreme Court cases. There's even a game you can play online to learn more about this, the redistricting game, where you actually draw districts to learn about it. It's lots and lots of separate steps. I even had a news story come across my email from Dr. Victor, actually, about a 5K, the gerrymandered 5K, where they drew a 5K route to follow the weird district boundary in the neighborhood to illustrate to people what is going on. Why do we have such a weird district boundary?
Good way to do that.
Yeah, it was very clever. It was very clever. All right. Any questions before we wrap up? Yes?
The thing I'm still fuzzy on is who draws the lines and why are people pitching more of a bid over it?
Okay, so I'll answer the second question. The second question is lots of people are pitching fits. That's why there are all these news stories about this. The first question is varied by state. In most states, the legislature that's in power when redistricting is triggered, which is when you get the census data, they get to draw the map. It's a legislative process. And so it's something that will come to the floor for a vote. And they just say, yep, we accept this map, or no, we don't. And so what that basically means is whichever party has the majority at that time is going to get the map that they want. And that's in, I think, most states. There are some states that have an independent panel of reviewers pick the map. They may draw the map or they may select the map from several maps provided to them. And so it's ostensibly an independent process. Sometimes those are sometimes that's an appointed commission, sometimes they're judges. What is the other? I think those are really the only two options I know of. Dr. Pinner, do you know of any other ways they do it?
Those are the ones I know.
Yeah. Because because of certain things you want to do, you can't totally automate it. It can't be all that a computer does. But those are the two main ways. And like I said, a lot of people are pitching a fit about it. Because each state legislature gets to decide its own rules for how to draw these maps, it's a hard problem to solve except with either lots of lobbying in your own state to get a better process put in place. But because the process favors the party in power, you can imagine that it creates a problem for changing the process. Because if I'm in power now and get to draw the map, I don't want to change the process. But if I'm not in power and want to change the process, I don't have the power to change the process. So that's why I think personally, probably a more fruitful approach would be federal legislation, is to try to get something on the federal level that tells the states, this is how you draw your maps. You cannot do it in such a way that it's partisan.
See, I thought there already was something.
There are some federal guidelines, like the one person, one vote, and compactness and contiguousness, and you can't split up a minority in order to depower that minority. But the actual rules are set by each state, the down to the nitty-gritty rules. Great question. Yes?
Kind of going back to Melbourne, why did the U.S. choose to do it? I don't know how to pronounce it again. Sorry for the cells.
The Voronoi cells? Well, sometimes it's just ignorance, and I don't mean that pejoratively. You have to know that that's an easy operation to do, to draw boundaries. Somebody has to tell you. And most legislators or most school board members aren't mathematicians. They may not know. And then it has to do with competing goals, right? The Voronoi cell problem solves the problem where you say, I want children to go to the school that's closest to them. You can imagine there are lots of other competing goals. Sometimes, like in our country, we had to desegregate schools. So if you have an area that's predominantly white or predominantly black, and you send children to the school that's closest to them, you may end up, not because you are trying to segregate the schools, but as a side effect, you might end up with segregated schools. So you may need to redraw districts to do that. So whenever you don't follow a certain ideal procedure, it usually means there's competing goals, and you can't meet all of them at the same time. I don't actually know why Williamson County keeps changing its lines in such a haphazard way. All I know is I would not want to live near the border of any district, because in any given year I would have no idea what school I was zoned for.
Wait, could you, like, in theory then, like, have to switch schools, like, several times?
Yes, I know. The reason I heard about this problem.
So, like, you can't just, like, there's not, like, a rule that says, like, okay, I started school in this district and I'm going to finish in this, like, line of schools?
There's
or
probably some rules about that, but if you, the challenge is, if you don't go to the school you're zoned for, in most districts, you have to provide your own transportation.
Yeah.
And so if you started zoned for a school that's far away from you, and it's not convenient for your parents to drive you there each day, and the border changes, then you can't get bused to that school. I think that's the, but yes, I have heard of particular cases where the school where a person's zoned for has changed multiple times over like a 5-year span. I think it's ridiculous too. That's what made me think of these board myself. I was like, why aren't they doing this? But I'm not on the school board in Williamson County. Well, if you have any other questions, I want to make sure you all can get where you need to go. I'll stick around.